Welcome everyone to the KoreaHerald Books Podcast.
We're your hosts, Beth and Naomi.
Hello.
We're both copy editors at the KoreaHerald.
That's right. And for regular listeners of the KoreaHerald podcast, this is a special episode in which we have an in-depth conversation about a work of Korean literature that has been translated into English. We will provide all the details about the works we discuss in the show notes.
So before we start, I'd like to say a little bit about myself. I am from Hong Kong, and before working at the KoreaHerald, I was a journalist at an English newspaper in Hong Kong, covering Hong Kong news, housing, urban planning. And Beth, what about you?
For me, I'm originally born in Korea, in Seoul, and my family moved to the UK when I was 7, and I lived there for 2 years, and I grew up in Canada for the rest of my childhood, and I came back to Korea 8 years ago to teach English and translate, and now I'm back in journalism, which is actually my field of specialization. So, yeah, and I'm a copy editor here, as Naomi said. So we're releasing this on a special day, aren't we, Naomi?
Yes, so you're listening or watching on the 8th of March, which is International Women's Day. So to commemorate, we've chosen this collection of 9 female authors who are heavyweights in Korea's literary scene.
That's right. Today we are discussing The Future of Silence, fiction by Korean women, edited and translated by Ju-chan and Bruce Fulton.
The 9 stories in this work range from the 1970s to early 2010s.
Authors include Park Wan-suh, So Young-eun, Oh Jung-hee, Kim Ji-won, Gong Sun-ok, Chun Eun-young, Kim Sa-kwa, Han Yu-ju, and Kim Eran.
We've picked 3 of our favorite stories from the collection, and we'll talk about how they might speak to broader themes in our own lives and Korean society. So let's get started on our first story. We picked Identical Apartments, which was published in 1974 and by Park Wan-suh. And to tell you about what happens, this story is set in the backdrop of during South Korea's rapid industrialization, which began in the mid-1960s. And we follow the protagonist, who is an unnamed woman. She's married and mother to 2 twin boys. And it begins with her living at her parents' house with her older brother and his wife and their children. And she and her husband eventually save enough money to move out to a new apartment, one that was very typical of nuclear families to live in at the time, around the mid-1970s. And it follows her and her neighbors in that new apartment. So, Beth, what was striking about this story to you when you read it?
So this was one of the stories that I discussed in my book review, and some of the themes that really stood out to me was that this really got to the small meanness of middle-class Korean life in urban settings. So one of the quotes that really stood out to me was when the narrator describes, after moving to the new apartment, she muses about why she feels so empty inside. She says, quote, "And so I waste day after day as I, Tori's mom, and women in other apartments try to live better than others, but instead end up resembling one another." So she is basically reflecting on the emptiness of her life, which is lived in relation to others, and her happiness and the value and the worth of her life is always in relation to her neighbors, namely Tori's mom, who is the woman who lives right across the hallway from her. And I wanted to know, what did you think of the story?
So even though this was published in the 1970s, I didn't feel like it was from that time at all. I mean, I would have believed it if you told me this was published, recently, because I feel like a lot of Koreans face the same problems as they do in this story, trying to save up to buy a house, and they're just forever just chasing this endless list of, milestones in their life. And in Hong Kong, too, we face the same problems. We'll never earn enough to buy our own apartment, and when we do, it's always a constant competition with, trying to get the best things for the apartment to look a certain way. So this story definitely resonated with me, and I felt like it dealt with a lot of the problems then as we still face now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really interesting that this story, even though it was written in 1974, right, still feels so relevant for us as urban dwellers here in Seoul, and also for you, Naomi, because your home is not here, you're from Hong Kong, but it's also a huge metropolis like Seoul is. And I remember a conversation I had with a friend from Hong Kong who said that the housing market there is actually worse than Seoul, which just shocked me because I thought Seoul was the worst housing situation. But can you verify?
Yes, it has been one of the most expensive cities to live in terms of housing. But yeah, it is insane. A lot of young people just feel hopeless because they'll never earn enough to own their own apartment, and even if they do, it's like a shoebox. It's like a coffin, which I feel like is also present. The feeling of being boxed in these identical apartments is something that I felt while reading this story. Here, especially, that you have these frequent references to mirrors and how the apartments are the same, and how she is trying to emulate Chori's mom's apartment down to the type of curtains or furniture or even the food that she puts on the table. And then there's also that reference to the twin boys that the protagonist has, that she and the inability to tell them apart. And one of that quotes that really sort of brought that message home was, "But if the boys can be interchanged, does that mean that I, their mother, can be interchanged with another I?" So throughout this whole story, the author keeps talking about the idea of similarity and sort of asks, does it mean anything if her role is swapped with Chori's mom, for example? Yeah.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. The interchangeability and the, I guess, uselessness that she feels as a person is an interesting theme as well that you really, I think, picked up on. And just to put a personal spin on this, one of the reasons I chose this story was because I personally, coming from a Korean background but having lived overseas, I'd always been curious about the Korea that my parents knew and that they grew up in. And my mother, I remember, told me something that I never forgot. She said, Beth, one of the reasons I really wanted to leave Korea was the ugly concrete landscape. I really hate the apartments. And I really thought about that as I read this story, how my mother's personal experience of the urban landscape in Seoul, really shaped her life choices and her desire to leave. And I think that, Naomi, you had a quote about, from the story about the narrator's fantasy of moving away from the city. Can you share that with us?
Yeah, so the quote is, "With the 8 million won riding on that ticket, she can go out and buy herself a hillside plot in a beautiful city out in the country where the air is clean, and she can design her own house. She'll build a cozy home with an attic and a pointed roof." So just to give some context, this is the protagonist talking about Chori's mom, who decided to buy a lottery ticket. And she's fantasizing about the idea that if she wins a lottery, she'd be able to move out of Seoul, out of the city, and live and design her own house in a cozy home. And this really spoke to me because I feel like the author is equating the idea that when you design your house, it sort of dictates the kind of life that you are able to live. And here, throughout the story, we get a sense of, the apartments, the environment is very sterile, identical, uniform. But here, when she talks about house, it's outside the city, it's cozy. It feels like a sense of home, but the apartments, you don't get that coziness or homely feeling.
And just to bring it back to the present, I think we can both say that obviously Korea has changed a lot, and there's a lot more individuality now amongst especially Gen Z, millennials, younger people, and even beyond, across generations. There are people who are freer to express their true colors. But I thought for me, I really, really loved that this story helped me understand the roots of Korean urban culture and people's mindsets, and how that actually still has a certain influence, and there are traces of it that I can see here and there. And for me, that was why I chose this story. I think we're going to move on to our next story. Speaking of stifling middle-class life and apartments, our next story takes a very dark turn. This is called Wayfarer, written in 1983 by Jung-hee. And the story centers on Hee-ja, a woman recently released from the mental hospital for a fatal act of self-defense. She is abandoned by her family, friends, and the legal system. And we follow her through a single day in her life as she prepares to meet with some old college friends downtown in Seoul. So to start off, some of the themes that I found really powerful from this work was the stigmatization of insane, quote-unquote, women in Korean society, the whore versus Madonna complex, because that speaks to how Hee-ja was actually institutionalized, the victim narrative, in that in a lot of works of Korean literature and popular culture, the woman slowly goes insane in her passive, helpless victim state. I'm thinking of Kim Ji-young born 1982, and Jung-hee in The Vegetarian. In both, you could make an argument that both characters passively suffer and go insane. Obviously, because it's a novel, we are allowed inside their minds, and they have subjectivity in the book. But in the social context in which they live, they are powerless. And even though I'm not attacking any of those works for their merit, I did notice that this is a theme in Korean literature where women are quite passive and victims and just suffer as a result of the label that they get in society. On the other hand, Hee-ja, reclaiming her subjectivity, her personhood, and the quote that I really wanted to present here was when she says, this was exactly the meaningful work she wanted. She could earn a bit of money doing it. It would be a wonderful thing to do, and it made perfect sense. She's talking about her love for puppets. Before she got married, and abandoned by her family and her husband and all of her friends, she actually really loved making puppets for children's stage plays. And she's clearly very clear-headed and not at all a victim. And for me, that was what made her so powerful to me. And what was your take on this story, Naomi?
I definitely think that it was interesting to sort of be let into that inner monologue of that constant battle, that train of thought about what other people are saying and worrying that people are all talking behind her back and thinking that, she's insane. But she's also struggling with trying to reconnect and retake control of her life. So I thought that was interesting to sort of get that inner psyche. I thought what was most outstanding here was the author's choice of puppets. I wondered if you thought it was ironic. The author chose puppets as some sort of symbol, because here Haeja is trying to break free of the stereotypes or the things that people say, but she also likes making these puppets. That brings me to one of the quotes in the story, which she says, "Strangely, she felt pangs of sorrow as one by one she uncovered these items lying silently like ash in the trunk she herself had closed and no one had opened." And this is when she goes through her own stuff and she finds a princess puppet laying at the bottom, which is right before the incident, before she was hospitalized. It was like she was looking at herself, that she had made this beautiful thing, but it was just lying there and nobody had cared to open it or understand her. What did you feel the same, or what sort of struck you as you read this?
I couldn't agree with you more. I think the puppets was very ironic, and the fact that her passion before she got married and really sacrificed her individual interests was something very childlike and fantasy, like a fantasy world. And I think one thing that really struck me was when she took out the last puppet she had made before she really put it all away was a princess, right? It was a princess puppet. And the irony there is very palpable because her life is deeply, deeply the opposite of a fairy tale, deeply dysfunctional. And so it was very bittersweet, to say it lightly, that she takes out this princess, which no longer has any relevance or, I guess, proximity to her life at the point that we meet her as readers. But again, I think that the fact that she wants to get back on her feet, the fact that she has a will to survive, like that is just so powerful. And I think that there's just so much more space for characters like her.
Moving on to a lighter story, we go to New York City with Kim Ji-won's Almaden, written in 1988. So, as you may have noticed, deep disillusionment with married life is a common motif in Korean literature. And in this story, an unnamed woman runs a liquor shop with her emotionally distant husband in New York City sometime in the late 1980s, and fantasizes about a passionate affair with a white customer she calls Almaden, after the brand of white wine he always buys. And I apologize if I am butchering the pronunciation of the wine.
Let's just call him Al.
Yes, Al, the wine Al, or the man Al. So what really stood out to me here in this story was that the characters are not named. Mm-hmm. So they're always, the protagonist is referred to as the woman, the man, or Al, and her husband. And to me, I see it as the author wanting readers to feel like they could be that woman too, and anybody could be that woman, and those fantasies could be theirs too. Was that something that you picked up on when reading it as well?
Yeah. So one of the interesting things I noticed when researching Kim Ji-won herself, the author, she actually immigrated to New York City with her husband in the 1970s. So I can see a lot of autobiographical elements in this story, especially when the character is musing about the differences between American and Korean culture. And I think that maybe that was one of the reasons she didn't give a name to her narrator as well, because she was trying to get at a popular sentiment that perhaps a lot of women in her generation experience, which is a longing for a more freer and more expressive way of life than the one that they were afforded in Korea. And that's how I saw it. Yeah. And
you picked a really good quote that I felt really encapsulated that sort of sentiment of wanting to break free from that the stays of, Korean society and that view. Would you share that with us?
Yeah. So this unnamed woman whose husband really is very, 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 at the time, a typical emotionally distant husband, Korean husband. With her husband, she feels very dissatisfied, and she watches the American couples that come into the liquor shop to buy wine or spirits. And she thinks to herself, they were the people whose eyes didn't have to be dark, whose hair didn't have to be black, people who weren't afraid to express their affection. And she contrasts these couples with her own courtship and in Korea in general, where lovers, quote, lovers don't embrace in parks or subways or other public places. And I thought this was very telling because, and actually surprisingly, still relevant to a lot of what I experience and see in Korea today. There's a lot of still unspoken rules about propriety in public places. You don't see a lot of public displays of affection here. That's very different, obviously, in private places like motels or, people's private homes. But in public, like at cafes or at parks and such, I don't think you see as free expression still, even now in 2022, as you would maybe in other places. But I don't know. What do you think, Naomi?
Well, it wasn't... I grew up in Hong Kong, where I think in, Hong Kong or Chinese culture, it is quite similar in a way that Hong Kong people aren't, big fans of public displays of affection. Mm-hmm. So it didn't really occur to me because I grew up in the same sort of environment where I would see couples holding hands in Hong Kong and in parks and going out on dates, but it definitely would be unusual to see people openly being intimate in parks or wherever. So there are a lot of similarities, I feel, culturally, mm-hmm. of what is proper in terms of interacting with your significant other. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think actually a modern manifestation of this Korean fantasy or almost fetishization of the West and more liberal culture is in the reaction videos that I saw on YouTube, where Koreans react to Cardi B or to some, this
music
trend.
Videos.
Exactly, or to TikTok videos by Americans. And you still see this, I think, sense of Korean wonder at the uninhibited expressions of Americans. I don't know. Did you feel that as well? Do you feel that there's a connection here?
Yeah, I think even though sort of, there's Netflix and people will consume a lot of Western media now, I definitely still see people who are shocked or, they would find it, quite extreme that, this would be allowed on television.
That being said, I'm also shocked. I don't know about you, but I myself am as shocked as some of the Korean people at some of the content that's out there these days. So, yeah, maybe it's not just a Korean thing, but still. And is there anything that personally stood out to you from this story?
There was a lot of contrast, I felt like, in this story. You have, this monotonous life that this woman leads, and every day she's just manning the cashier in the store. And she keeps running into the same scenarios, but it's contrasted with, the change of seasons, and the clothes the man wears, and the notion of the wildness of her fantasies. So I thought that was really interesting, and I thought the choice, that she was running a liquor store was also interesting because wine, it's romantic, gives people the idea of, losing your inhibitions, and I thought that's really stood out to me when reading the story, that it was an intentional choice by the author.
Right. Yeah, it's so interesting that she is in a place of, I guess, losing your inhibitions, and yet she herself and her life is so inhibited. And that was an interesting tension there, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But you think, I thought it was interesting that, because this takes place in New York City, presumably, but that I still felt like she sort of put herself in that frame of mind where she was still thinking about the sense of propriety that a Korean society dictates. But she is actually already in New York where she can be free and she can, live the life, quote unquote, if she wanted to. But in her mind, it still feels like she's caged, or she cages herself in that way.
Yeah. No, that's a great point. And something that I notice as a common theme in my conversations with a lot of gyopo, like overseas Korean friends, is that sometimes immigrant Korean communities can be more conservative than, similar generation in Korea. Because let's say if your parents immigrated to the U.S. in the 70s, they bring all the 1970s Korean values with them. And the community is just fossilized with those values. This is not coming from me. This is just from conversations I have with friends. So I thought that was very interesting that there's a certain conservatism that gets preserved in diaspora Korean communities that are actually out of pace and are behind the actual Korea that exists today. So I think that's what made me pause and think, that's also an interesting aspect of this story as well. It's a snapshot of the mindset, perhaps, of many women that come to the U.S. or to the West from Korea. They bring a certain invisible policing with them that they have been socialized with from a very early age or from the culture. So, that's what I took away from it.
That is very insightful.
Thank you. So I think overall, to wrap up, what tied all three of these stories we discussed today together was their relevance to present-day Korea in so many ways. Relevance, by the way, of course, does not mean that they encapsulate or describe all of Korea today, but we see the strands that connect these stories to present day. We see the influence, and it helps deepen our understanding of Korea and the people that we see on a daily basis. So, with that...
Yeah, I really couldn't agree more with you. And we do want to hear from you, the listeners. So if you've read any of these stories in this collection or work by one of the authors we've mentioned, let us know what you think in the comments.
Yeah, and we do hope to continue doing these special episodes. So please let us know on Instagram, Facebook, or tweet us your favorite Korean women authors that you think we should cover or talk about for our next episode.
Thanks so much for joining us for this special episode. Bye-bye.
Catch you next time. Stay safe and warm. Let's say bye to this camera. Bye.
Bye.